Recently, I was listening to a podcast discussing how to navigate a crisis in faith. The topic is something familiar to me, as it's one of the things I've been struggling with since my teen years, and eventually led me here to Bucksmont. While I grew up with a mother who encouraged questions and observations, I went to school in an environment where questions, especially about topics such as faith, were seen as disrespectful. The respectful thing to do was just do as you were told. To recite this prayer, to say these words, and not to question why or your belief in them. But I had a lot of questions. But I also saw what happened to my peers who asked why, and how it impacted their grades and the way they were treated. So I kept my questions and my doubts to myself. They just kept bottling up inside. And I questioned my faith, or whether I even really had any to begin with. Did I believe any of these dogmas or the prayers in my heart? Or was I just really good at repeating back what I was told and expected to? I learned that to be good and to belong meant obedience, and no good could come from being asked questions about my faith. It made me angry and frustrated. And as I struggled with this crisis of faith and looked to those in authority in my life who didn't want these questions, they just wanted obedience. And it turned into a crisis of trust and respect for authority figures in my life. And there's nothing I hated more than being told what I should believe and to just do as I was told. Obedience to authority and just doing what you're told reminds me of the phrase, just following orders. A defense heard often in the Nuremberg trials for the Nazi war crimes. It was something that really stood out to Stanley Milgram, a psychologist at Yale. It was so interesting to him that he developed a study now known as the Milgram experiment to focus on the conflict of obedience and authority. The participants were told that they would be a teacher and administering a test to a learner who was in the other room. The participant would be in the first room with a researcher, unaware that the learner was an actor and in on the experiment. The participant was then told that they would administer a shock to the learner whenever they answered a question incorrectly, increasing the shock each time, and they were told that these shocks would not cause any permanent damage besides temporary pain. The board in front of them had switches with volts marked from 15 volts, a light shock, all the way up to 350 volts labeled danger, and continuing on to 450 volts. With each incorrect answer, a fake shock was administered. As the level of these fake shocks increased, the learner acted as if they were increasingly more and more pain and begging for it to stop. The researcher, or authority figure, in the lab coat and clipboard would urge the participant to carry on with a set of phrases. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It's absolutely essential that you continue, and you have no choice but to continue. The end result showed that even with some hesitation, 65% of the participants went up to the 450 volts at the urging of the researcher. And all participants went up to at least the 350 volt marked as dangerous. Milgram wrote in 1974 article, The Perils of Obedience, the extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any lengths on the command of an authority constitutes the chief finding of the study and the most urgently demanding explanation. Even when the destructive effects of their work become patently clear, and they are asked to carry out actions incompatible with the fundamental standards of morality, relatively few people have the resources needed to resist authority. I hear that assessment, and I think back to my education and the culture around respect for authority being obedience, and I find the idea frightening. Were these participants taught that to question leadership and authority was disrespectful? Where does that leave us as a society, and how can we fix it? In her talk, Dare to Disagree, Margaret Heffernan points to the University of Delft and says, the university requires that its PhD students have to submit 5 statements that they are prepared to defend. Doesn't really matter what the statements are about. What matters is that the candidates are willing and able to stand up to authority. I think it's a fantastic system. But I think leaving it to PhD candidates is far too few people and way too late in life. I think we need to be teaching these skills to kids and adults at every stage of their development if we want to have thinking organizations and a thinking society. Honestly, I couldn't agree more. Thinking organizations and thinking societies are what we need, not blind obedience, and not shouting matches and name-calling that shut down all forms of conversation. Imagine if, as part of everyone's learning growing up, we were routinely taught how to respectfully stand up to authority. You would eliminate a lot of ingrained fear that comes with doing so. If you teach people to be comfortable to stand up to authority, to question and be questioned by authority figures, you're in turn making them comfortable with the idea that if they themselves are in leadership or an authority position, they may be more accepting of being questioned and critiqued. Sometimes listening to critics is one of the most important things a leader can do. But as those doing the critiquing, we too need to be able and willing to listen. Bob Langbert, the former VP of Sustainability at McDonald's, says that listening to your toughest critics is one of the most important things that a business or a leader can do. He talks about being involved in protests and sit-ins during the anti-Vietnam movement in his youth, but as an adult, finding himself in the position of authority in corporate America. One of the toughest critics he listened to was the Environmental Defense Fund. They wanted to push for McDonald's to pivot to reusables. Dishes, basically. Langbert was now open for the conversation, but as the EDF observed and listened to how McDonald's serves their customers, they realized that reusables was not the answer here. But by listening and working with each other, they made changes, such as the types of paper used for bags and napkins, and changing the napkin size that had a big impact in McDonald's sustainability. No, it was not the vision that the EDF initially had for the changes McDonald's needed to make, but they listened and evolved with their critique and solutions. Langbert says that if you need to assume the best intentions of your critics, you also have to come into a discussion with the best intentions yourself. We need more hard conversations like that. But hard conversations do not mean harsh accusations and assumptions used as weapons. It means we need to speak our truth, and we also need to be willing to listen. I think back to my time in grade school and high school, and I remember my fear in asking questions and challenging authority. What would have happened if a question wasn't seen as disrespectful? What if I could ask questions, and if I could have had a hard conversation where I listened and was listened to, where opinions were debated instead of dictated? Brene Brown describes these kind of hard conversations as a rumble. Brene says a rumble is a discussion with a commitment to lean into vulnerability, stay curious and generous, and to listen with the same passion with which we want to be heard. She says the most important part is open hearts and open minds. If we come at a challenge to authority with these things, then to question authority can be respectful. When I was searching for a spiritual home, one of my biggest issues I had was, what beliefs does this religion say I have to have? And who was telling me that? What really drew me to Buxmont was the idea of the questions and the search for truth. As Unitarian Universalists, we believe in principles of acceptance of one another and encouragement in spiritual growth, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, and the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process. These principles say that yes, you should speak out when you see something wrong, and yes, you should engage in conversations and debate. But we know from our first two principles that there is an inherent worth and dignity of every person, and justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. If that doesn't say open hearts and open minds, then I don't know what does.